Give me just a minute to rearrange my windows here and then we'll get started. Okay, well, thank you very much, Andrew and Katharina, for inviting me to join you today. I don't get many opportunities to talk to philosophers, so I'm really excited to present my work and hear your thoughts on this project today. As Andrew mentioned, my background is in psychology and I'm currently in a political science department, so I very much take an interdisciplinary approach to research. I do some work with neuroscience as well, although I'll be talking less about that today. So the work that I'm going to talk about today focuses on looking at how threat and identity influence conspiracy endorsement, and in particular, how conspiracy endorsement changes over time as a function of the political context that we find ourselves in. So there have been a couple different approaches to studying conspiracy endorsement. One is to look at the types of people who tend to endorse these, and there certainly are individual differences that contribute, and I'll talk a little bit about that. And the other is to look at how endorsement shifts over time. So it may be that there are certain circumstances under which more people find themselves attracted to these ideas. And that's kind of the perspective that I'm going to focus a bit more about on in my talk today. On October 8th of 2020, a number of individuals were arrested in a plot to kidnap the governor of Michigan, Gretchen Whitmer. The FBI arrested 14 suspects accused of plotting to kidnap her and overthrow the state government of Michigan. These suspects were tied to a group called the Wolverine Watchmen, which is a paramilitary militia group tied to the so-called Boogaloo movement, whose stated goals are to eradicate government and overthrow law enforcement officers. Interestingly, they were using Facebook and social media to recruit until June of 2020, when these groups were banned from social media. So this has been one of the ongoing debates, of course, to what extent we allow free speech when it might perhaps lead to violence. Now, more relevant to today's talk, some of the suspects expressed support for various conspiracies. So things like the Russia counter narrative, or the idea that any sort of investigation related to Russia was just a ploy by Democrats or law enforcement to steal the election from Donald Trump, the 2016 election in this case, although there were similar themes that emerged in 2020, as well as a variety of other conspiracies. So COVID-19 denial, QAnon, of course, conspiracies about Bill Gates or the deep state, and vaccine conspiracies as well. So there was a lot of conspiratorial thinking present in the online discussions of these individuals. Part of why I bring this up is because this is not necessarily an isolated incident. So this was certainly kind of surprising and shocking at the time when these individuals were arrested. But the threat of violence is ongoing, and the threat of violence from conspiratorial thinking in particular is ongoing. So experts were really worried about election 2020, kind of prior to the election and in the aftermath of the election. And of course, we saw that culminate in the events of January 6th of 2021, when a number of individuals actually violently attacked the US Capitol building. This is not to say that this was driven only by conspiracies and conspiratorial thinking, but that certainly played a role here in terms of thinking about conspiracies about voter fraud. And I think, continues to persist through many conspiracies about COVID, as well as conspiracies that persist about Donald Trump. So in particular, given that we're now in August of 2021, I thought I'd mention the conspiracy that Donald Trump is going to be reinstated as president a week from today, next Friday, August 13th. So these conspiracies persist, right? And sometimes we have the tendency to kind of laugh them off and say, this stuff just sounds crazy. Why should we care about this? But part of why I like to start with these examples is just to say, in some cases, this really matters because it has the potential to motivate action, and in particular, to motivate political violence. That's not to say that conspiratorial thinking always does this. It certainly doesn't. But it has important consequences with respect to violence or with respect to things like vaccine hesitancy, as we're seeing in recent months as well. So if we take a step back and think about conspiracies in the context of American politics, it's certainly the case that conspiracies have been popping up in recent election cycles, including 2016 and 2020. But and conspiratorial narratives are surprisingly popular among the American public. So again, I think the tendency sometimes is to dismiss this as a fringe phenomenon, which at the extremes it probably is. But if you do a survey of the American public and you present them with a list of conspiracies, which is what they did in this the Oliver and Wood work, it is the case that many Americans will endorse at least one conspiracy. Maybe they'll dismiss most of them, but maybe they say, hey, that one sounds like it kind of makes sense to me. This is not, it's gotten a lot of attention in recent years, but it's not necessarily a new phenomenon in American politics. There's a long history of conspiratorial thinking in American politics, and you can find many examples of this historically. But arguably, it becomes even more problematic in the current era of the internet and social media, given the increased potential for rapid spread of information online and kind of the decline in what we call gatekeepers that has happened along with the rise of the internet and social media. So it's not the case that conspiracies are new, but the way that conspiracies travel and spread online has shifted over time and has become much easier for these things to be transmitted, especially through social media like Facebook, for example. So in the aftermath of the 2016 election, there's been an increased focus on misinformation and disinformation and online polarization. And this kind of persisted into 2020 and beyond, of course, now is very relevant with COVID too. So if we look at the psychology of conspiracy endorsement, what types of factors have people identified in terms of trying to understand what leads people to endorse conspiracies? There's a lot of work on personality and individual differences in cognitive style, which I'm actually going to focus on less today, but this work has shown that certain types of people are maybe just kind of more prone to paranoid thinking. They're more likely to engage in conspiratorial thinking. It's also the case that there are a handful of papers that have tied cognitive style in terms of the way in which people engage in reasoning, and in particular, logical reasoning, making it, if people are sort of lower on these cognitive indicators, they're more likely to engage in this type of thinking too. Other types of factors that are important are things like motivated reasoning. And if you're not familiar with this term, this is the idea that people are not always engaged in open-minded information search, but rather sometimes they have already decided what they want the conclusion to be before they engage in thinking about information. So what this theory suggests is that if you already have a desired conclusion or a desired end goal that you'd like to reach, then when you see incoming information, you're not processing it in an unbiased manner. You're more likely to accept information that confirms what you believe and argue against information that's inconsistent with what you believe. So there's a pretty big literature now in psychology and political psychology on this idea of motivated reasoning. It has been applied to conspiracy endorsement. So in that domain, the idea would be that people are more likely to endorse conspiracies that are sort of appealing to them already, given their political leanings. And I'll come back to this idea kind of throughout the talk today. There's some other work that's looked at the role of things like political knowledge and trust in government. So unsurprisingly, if people have lower trust in government, they're more likely to engage in conspiratorial thinking about politics. And I think in this paper, they also showed that kind of a counterintuitive finding where higher political knowledge actually was associated with more of this thinking, which, maybe that's a bit of a puzzling finding. There's some other work that suggests that political identity is relevant here. So some work in political psychology and political science has argued that political conservatism is more associated with conspiratorial thinking, although I'm going to challenge that a little bit in the talk today. Other work has suggested that maybe it's not just conservative, but kind of people who are more extreme in both directions. So maybe people are strongly identified as conservative or Republican, or people who are strongly identified as liberal or liberal or Democrats should be more likely to engage in this type of thinking. So maybe it's not conservatism or not only conservatism, but also extremity that could play a role. And I will talk about this a bit later in the talk. There's also been suggestion that political context matters, and in particular, people have suggested that electoral wins and losses might be important here. So maybe when people win elections, there's less of a need to engage in this type of conspiratorial thinking. But if you lose an election, or if you're afraid that you will lose an election, then people might find themselves feeling threatened and being more attracted to these sorts of ideas. And that's part of the argument that I'm going to spell out a little bit more to motivate the data that I'll show you today. So related to that is the role of emotion, and Usinski and Parent have also argued that threat might be relevant here. The work that's been done previously has mostly been correlational or archival, so doing things like rating old newspaper stories after an election to see if there's any evidence for kind of language that would signify threat, and that being associated with conspiratorial thinking. So there hasn't really been a ton of research on this yet in terms of empirical work, and that's kind of where we're going to come in and try to fill that gap. I thought it might be useful just to take a step back for a minute and talk about this kind of in the broader context of political psychology work and the general approach that we're taking in this line of work. And it can be situated in kind of a broader literature called emotion in politics, or emotion in political cognition. There's a growing body of work, mainly in political psychology, but also in social psychology to some extent too, that has focused on looking at how emotion impacts both political cognition and behavior. So, for many years, I think in political science, emotion didn't get a lot of attention. People were really focused on this idea that kind of a more economic perspective, right? That people should weigh the costs and benefits associated with different policy choices and make their decisions based on that. But over time, both in psychology and political science, we start to see more and more evidence that people don't always do this, right? They don't necessarily make rational decisions about politics. So emotion is one alternative mechanism by which we can start to understand some of the way in which context influences the political decisions people make. So a lot of people are doing work on this, not just me, but I was going to give you a couple examples from our own past research, just to give you a sense of what this work looks like. Now, emotion can either be measured through self-report. So in many cases, people just kind of ask individuals the extent to which they're feeling different emotions in relation to politics, or in some cases, it's manipulated through experimental manipulation. So there are different ways of doing this, but you can kind of prime different emotions to activate these in people and then look at how that changes their political decision-making. So a couple examples here. First, on the left here is a paper that we published in 2014, where we looked at uncertainty and threat and how they impact political tolerance. So political tolerance here we're defining as the notion that people who you disagree with politically should still have civil liberties, basically. So if people disagree with you politically, do you think they should still be able to give a public speech? Should they still be able to express their opinions about politics and engage in the political process, or not? So people can sort of range in how they rate this on a scale. So in that paper, we manipulated both uncertainty and threat. So we put people into, it kind of primed them basically with uncertainty or not, and then we primed them with threat or a control condition. So there were 4 possible conditions. They were either threatened or not, and then uncertain or not on top of that. And what we found maps onto this figure that I've included here on the slide, that uncertainty by itself is not bad for political discourse. So uncertainty by itself actually leads to more open-mindedness and increased tolerance in our data. But when uncertainty was paired with threat, you tend to see a much more negative, so to speak, reaction, such that people were more likely to become defensive and closed-minded. So people under this kind of emotional situation are much less likely to engage in open-minded deliberation, and they showed a decrease in political tolerance. So we looked at that by measuring tolerance with the scale and then examining the effective condition on that outcome variable. We've done some similar work looking at political compromise, and we find kind of a similar pattern. So uncertainty by itself motivates support for political compromise in the same kind of theoretical view that it increases open-mindedness. But if uncertainty is paired with threat, we found a decrease in the likelihood that people said they would compromise. And in this paper, we looked at this in a couple different ways. We looked at it in relation to the government shutdown that happened in 2013 surrounding Obamacare, whether or not people were willing to compromise about that. And then we also did some experimental work in that paper too, manipulating uncertainty and threat and measuring support for compromise, and found a similar pattern. So these are just a couple examples of the type of approach that, that we and others have been taking to try to look at this. I'm not going to talk much more about uncertainty, but we are going to look at threat in relation to conspiracy endorsement. So in the work that I'll talk about today, we're focused on a theoretical approach where we look at conspiracy endorsement as something that is context dependent and shifts over time as a function of first, political threat. So we expect that political threat should increase conspiracy endorsement. And political threat might come from different sources. So it could come from election outcomes, as people have suggested previously. If you anticipate that you're going to lose an election, that should feel threatening. If you actually do lose an election, perhaps especially if that's an unexpected loss, that should produce feelings of threat. But this could come from other threats, any other perceived threats to the political in-group, and we take the view that this is a subjective sense of threat on the part of people experiencing it. So it doesn't need to be necessarily an objective threat. It can just be the sense that my group is threatened, whether or not that's objectively true. Second, we expect that conspiracy endorsement should be influenced by political identity. And we take kind of a motivated reasoning approach here. So we think that people who are politically identified should be more likely to endorse conspiracies targeting their political outgroup. In other words, if I'm a liberal, I should be more likely to endorse conspiracies that blame conservatives for engaging in sort of nefarious actions, and vice versa. Conservatives, who are, especially those who are highly identified, should be more likely to endorse conspiracies targeting liberals. We also expect that the threat effect may be moderated by or may interact with identity. So it's not necessarily the case that identity and threat are just operating independently, but when people feel threatened, that may sort of interact with or activate their identity in a way that these kind of combine to produce more of this type of thinking, if that makes sense. So emotion may increase identity-based motivated reasoning, leading a broader swath of the electorate to be attracted to conspiracies. And this is one of the reasons why we argue that, again, conspiratorial thinking is not just a fringe phenomenon. It may be that may be the case some of the time, but when we get into conspiracies about presidential candidates or conspiracies about elections, conspiracies about voter fraud, or even some of these conspiracies about vaccines and COVID, it's not just a handful of people who are endorsing these. It's a much broader segment of the American population. And this may be one approach to trying to understand why. So before we started engaging in trying to actually collect some empirical data to look at these questions, we wanted to take a step back and try to make sure that we had a good working definition of what a political conspiracy actually is. And there's been quite a bit of discussion about how to define this in political science and psychology. It can be surprisingly difficult to define, and it also can be difficult to agree on what counts as a conspiracy and what doesn't. So when you're actually trying to generate a list of these to use in empirical research, it's really hard to kind of remove your own biases from the process. So we had kind of a team of researchers who tried to put this together, and then we pilot tested the statements that we came up with. The definition that we've adopted is a definition that comes from a paper by Wood and colleagues in 2012. That a conspiracy is a proposed plot by powerful people or organizations working together in secret to accomplish some usually sinister goal. So we tried to focus on this notion, this definition of what a conspiracy was. We did generate a pretty long list of political conspiracies. And we've since updated this list for later data collection. But initially, we were generating conspiracies kind of surrounding the 2016 election. So some of these, we generated a list of political conspiracies specifically. Some of them pertain to the candidates in 2016, so Trump and Clinton, but some of them were not specific to the candidates. They were broader than that, but still tied to politics. In the pilot study, we had participants rate who would be more likely to believe this. So is this something liberals or conservatives should be more likely to endorse? Then we had them rate how believable is it, just on a 1 to 7 scale. And based on this pilot data, we selected 10 liberal and 10 conservative statements to use in subsequent research, and we tried to equate those unbelievability. So what we were really trying to do was create equivalent lists of conspiracies that liberals would endorse and conspiracies that conservatives would endorse. And we were trying to be careful about this because of the past research that's shown that conservatives might be more likely to endorse. The argument is that in some of those papers, it could be the case that they found that because the list of conspiracies they had presented to participants were just more conservative conspiracies, right? So it's really careful to select the stimuli in such a way that you're allowing for both sides to endorse them, and then we can better test to see if there is a difference there or not, if that makes sense. So a couple example items, and these are some of the initial items we used in 2016. Again, we did kind of update this for our later data collection, so we weren't as focused on the 2016 election, but these are just a couple examples. So Republicans should be more likely to endorse this first one. Political forces are rigging the 2016 election by destroying ballots cast for Donald Trump so that Hillary Clinton becomes president. And Democrats should be more likely to endorse the second one, the idea that the war on drugs was declared in order to destroy the political power of minority communities. So just a couple examples. Okay, so I'm going to talk next about the data that we have in this project, and there are 3 studies. So I'll give kind of a brief summary of the data collection effort, and then I'll go through and talk about methods and results for each of the 3 studies. The first 2 studies that we conducted were surrounding the 2016 election. So we used the 2016 election as what's called a natural experiment. So we collected data prior to the election and after the election, and that allowed us to look at the effect of the election outcome on conspiracy endorsement. So if you win versus lose the election, does that change the degree to which you support these conspiracy theories? We had 2 different samples, so we did rely on convenient samples for these, in part because this was kind of an idea that we had kind of last minute prior to the election. So we were trying to collect data from wherever we had available at the time. We used University of Nebraska undergraduate students for what I'm calling study 2 here. And then in study 1, we collected data from Amazon's Mechanical Turk, which is kind of a crowdsourcing platform online. These tend to be older adults. I think the average age is usually around 30. A little bit more diverse than a student population, although sometimes MTurk is not super politically diverse. It's also tends to be people who are a little more like upper socioeconomic status. So in that respect, it's not really more diverse necessarily than an undergraduate population. So a bit more diversity in terms of things like age, but still not really a representative sample for either of those. We collected data for both. We collected data at 3 time points, but the time scale is slightly different. So this box here on the slide shows you when data was collected. Don't worry too much about these details. I'll try to remind you of this when I show you the results. But we, in both cases, collected data before and after the election, before and right after the election. And then with the MTurk data, we collected data again, I think in early January. And then with the students, we collected data one more time, kind of later the next spring. So in the spring of 2017, which would have been after Donald Trump took office. So just to kind of, get you back in the mindset of the 2016 election, because I know this was a while ago now, The expectation really for many people had been that Hillary Clinton was going to win. So I think a lot of the predictions suggested that she had a pretty high chance of winning. So prior to the election, people were kind of expecting a Clinton win. After the election, when Trump actually won, people were a bit surprised. And that, I think, will be relevant in terms of talking about the data that I'll show you in just a minute. Okay, and then by spring, Donald Trump is actually president. So that's kind of the surrounding context here. We did do a third study where we actually ran a survey experiment with a nationally representative sample of Americans. So this was a much larger sample, and it was recruited to be representative of US demographics in terms of, age, gender, income, and then we tried to make sure that we had a representative sample of Republicans and Democrats as well. And that was conducted in summer of 2019, so while Donald Trump was president. So I'll talk about that as well and why we did that. All right, so I'm going to talk about the first couple studies first, using the 2016 election as a natural experiment. We looked at the effect of time, and this was timing related to the real world election outcome. So was it before or after the election, as I kind of outlined on the previous slide. We measured political threat by asking our participants how threatened they felt by government and how threatened they felt by politicians in government. And this was a pretty simple measure. They just rated this on a 1 to 5 scale from very unthreatened to very threatened. For analysis, we combined these two items. They were highly correlated and mean centered them. And I'll show you just kind of a snapshot of what that threat data looks like, I think on the next slide. We also measured political ideology, again, in a pretty simple, straightforward way that's pretty common in political psychology, simply by asking people to self-report the extent to which they're very liberal as a 1 on a scale to very conservative being a 7 on the scale. There's a bit of a debate in political psychology about whether it's okay to just ask people to identify, or if you need to kind of measure policy positions or values and identify what people's ideology is based on that, and people have different views on this. Given that we're more interested in kind of how people identify and their political identity, we were taking this kind of more self-report approach because we don't necessarily care how it maps on to the underlying values. We care more about how people are thinking about themselves in relation to these groups. We then had people rate a number of conspiracy items from on a 1 to 5 scale, from being definitely not true to definitely true. So this was what we decided on in terms of how to have them evaluate these. And this included our pilot tested conspiracies that target liberals, conspiracies that target conservatives, and then we also had some non-political conspiracies mixed in there just as kind of a baseline. I'm not going to talk too much more about those today, but there is more information on that in the draft of our paper that's posted on SciArchive if you're interested in that. Okay, so first, we just wanted to check and make sure that the election outcome actually did have some relationship with threat, as that was kind of key to our theorizing here. We thought that the election outcome should influence threat, and that should be what changes conspiracy endorsement. So we start by just looking at whether threat shifted over time. And on these figures, on the y-axis is political threat, and it's mean centered just based on the mean threat level in the sample. So this is kind of a relative indicator. The data is split here just for ease of visualization into conservatives in red and liberals in blue. In our first sample, the MTurk participants, we found that prior to the election, conservatives expressed much higher threat than liberals, which makes sense given the expectation had been that Clinton was going to win. So conservatives presumably were feeling threatened because of this expectation of a Clinton win in 2016. After the election, that basically flips. So liberals express higher levels of threat right after the election than conservatives. Interestingly, in this data, and this was like December, January, the threat had gone back down a little bit. So there was this kind of big shock to liberals after the election, but it kind of died off a little bit, at least prior to the actual inauguration of Donald Trump in January. So this data was prior to inauguration. In the second sample with the students, you see kind of a similar pattern. So threat was higher for conservatives prior to the election. It jumped way up for liberals after the election. And then at time 3, now this is where this data differs because this is actually after Donald Trump is president. So the threat level for conservatives went way down at that point, but threat for liberals was still elevated. So, we don't have like a full sample of data across time, but what we think was going on is that maybe people kind of relaxed a little bit in December, and then liberals were feeling worse again after Trump took office. So this is just to say that yes, threat did fluctuate over time in relation to the election outcome and anticipation about the election prior to the election. So the main question that we wanted to then ask is, does threat explain or help to explain conspiracy endorsement? To look at this, we ran a pretty complicated statistical model, which I'll try to walk you through just kind of the gist of what's important here. We looked at conspiracy type, so whether they were the general non-political conspiracies, conspiracies that should be more likely to be endorsed by liberals or conservatives. We look at participant ideology, whether participants themselves identify as liberal or conservative. We look at political threat, and then we look at time, so kind of before or after the election. We control in these models for age, education, gender, race, and income. These are kind of standard socio-demographic variables that get used often in political science. So overall, we find significant main effects if we just look at this, ignoring, to start with, if we just ignore the type of conspiracy, we do find that threat predicts conspiracy endorsement across the board. And in this data, at least, we did find some support for the idea that conservatism predicted endorsement. So conservatives overall, if you ignore the type of conspiracy, were a little more likely to endorse than liberals. But we found that threat increased endorsement for both liberals and conservatives. So it's not the case that threat only increases conspiracy endorsement for conservatives. It also increases conspiracy endorsement for liberals. And then we find evidence for the idea that liberals are more likely to endorse conspiracies targeting conservatives and vice versa. So we find that in our data, which was consistent with our pilot data too. I'm going to show you next the pattern of data, what the pattern of data looks like if we kind of break this down over time. And this, I apologize in advance, like this is real world data. It's a bit messier once you actually break it down in this way, but I'll show you the data on the next couple slides and try to help interpret like what we want you to take away from it, what we think the gist is of what's going on. So we look at this as a function of all 4 of these variables kind of simultaneously. And to visualize this, just to orient you to the figure here, so on this slide, you'll see data for conspiracies targeting conservatives. So these are conspiracies that liberals should be more likely to endorse, blaming conservatives for engaging in nefarious actions. In this first figure is the data from our first sample, and then in the second figure is the data from our second sample. But again, these are all the conspiracies targeting conservatives. The way this is plotted is that on the y-axis is the likelihood of endorsing conspiracy theories. So higher scores here indicate greater endorsement. On the x-axis is the level of threat that people express, political threat that people expressed. And then in each of these boxes are the effects across time. So time 1, time 2, and time 3, which again, the time scale is slightly different for time 3 across these samples. And then last but not least, this is split by participant identification. And given that this is already fairly complicated, we just did a split here. So you're seeing conservatives versus liberals rather than the full range of the scale. So I know this is a lot to look at. I'll try to help simplify what we think the patterns are here. Overall, there's a main effect of participant ideology such that, as expected with these, liberals in the dotted lines here are more likely to endorse these conspiracies than conservatives in the solid lines. And you can see that that pattern holds pretty much throughout, maybe with the exception of this box here. So there is a main effective ideology. There's also a main effective threat. So as threat increases, and again, you can see this in most of the boxes here, as threat gets higher, endorsement also gets higher. And that varies kind of as a function of identity in these different boxes, but the overall pattern is consistent with that notion. And then we also, in some cases, find a threat by ideology interaction, and this would be statistical support for the idea that threat behaves differently depending on people's identification. So in some cases, here, liberals are responding more to threat in terms of this type of conspiracy endorsement. So if I'm a liberal, I feel political threat, I'm more likely to endorse these conspiracies that target conservatives as the bad actor. So we see that kind of prior to the election here. We also see that after the election. We get kind of this weird effect in this sample, and maybe we can talk more about this if people are interested, but conservatives actually showed this effect in our MTurk data right after the election, and this may have been driven, we don't have the ability to disentangle this really, but this might have been driven by conservatives who were so-called never Trumpers, so Republicans who were upset by the election of Donald Trump in 2016, and there were a handful of these people, might have experienced threat, and they might have been more likely to endorse conspiracies at that time. But again, we don't make too much of that in the data. So what to take away from this is that, yes, there's an effective threat, there is an effective identity too, and sometimes those interact. So sometimes identity kind of exacerbates the threat effect for people on conspiracy endorsement. We see a pretty, in some ways, a similar pattern when we look at conspiracies targeting liberals, although overall the pattern is a bit different, and I'll try to point out why we think that. Here, the important things to note are that you basically see these lines are reversed. So now these are conspiracies targeting liberals. Endorsement is higher for conservatives in the solid lines than for liberals in the dotted lines. Overall, threat does increase endorsement here too, although after the election, this levels off a bit more. So, I guess the simplest way to see this is to look at the slopes of the lines being steeper prior to the election. So in these two boxes labeled time one, after the election, this levels off, suggesting that for conservatives, and we know that threat was just kind of lower for conservatives overall, but when we look at this, threat was not as big of a motivating factor in terms of predicting conspiracy endorsement after the election. There were still conservatives engaged in conspiracy endorsement after the election, but it was driven more by identity after the election than it was driven by threat. So, it is complicated once you try to disentangle this real world data, but what we think is going on is that maybe identity produces a kind of a more constant effect, but something like threat is shifting more over time. And that's really what's changing with election outcomes. So my identity is always going to motivate maybe some level of endorsement about my political outgroup. But this may be exacerbated in times when, people just lost an election, or they just won an election, or things are changing politically. Okay, so I'm going to shift gears a little bit and talk about the survey experiment we did, and then I will, I just have a few slides summarizing this, and then I will try to wrap up before too much longer. The survey experiment we ran, so the natural experiment is nice because it takes advantage of something that's actually happening out there in the real world. But it doesn't give us as much experimental control over the situation. So we're not able to obviously, control who won or lost the election. So what we have from that is an example where Democrats lost the election and Republicans won the election. But what we want to be able to do is look at a scenario where we can threaten either Democrats or Republicans and see if they behave in the same way. So we did an experiment where we could prime people with political threat and then look at whether it had a causal impact on their level of conspiracy endorsement. So we conducted this experiment a bit later in summer of 2019, so after Donald Trump was in office. We recruited participants using Dynata, which is a survey company. They recruited a nationally representative sample for us. Participants were then randomly assigned to either a political threat or a control condition, and I'll outline what those conditions looked like in just a minute. And this was based on their political party identification as either Republican or Democrat. So when participants started the survey, and this was an online survey, and they were asked about their political leaning, and here we switched to political party because, as a psychologist, I don't know that it makes a huge difference whether you're asking about party or ideology, as long as people are identified with the group. But political scientists tend to think of political party as being more of a group, given it's actually sort of a group that has meetings and functions in that way. So we switched to party for this third experiment. So we asked people if they are Republicans or Democrats, or if they say they're independent, we ask them which way they lean. And most people will then say that they lean one way or the other. And we put those people with Republicans or Democrats, just so we wouldn't have to drop as many participants from the sample. If they still, when you ask them the leaner question, if they still just say, no, I really don't lean one way or the other, then we did drop those people from the study. But that's I forget how many, it's a relatively small number. In the political threat conditions, participants were presented with a scenario and were asked to take a few minutes to think about it, and they had to write a written response in the survey in response to this scenario. So they were asked to think about the text that we gave them was that many people in the United States feel disappointed with the nation's condition, and many citizens feel that the country has reached a low point in terms of social, economic, and political factors. In the Democrat threat condition, this was blamed on Democrats. So our Democratic participants saw that things are really not great, and it's blamed on Democrats. So what we're trying to do here is threaten the participants' political in-group, make them feel like there's some sense of threat surrounding their group. In the Republican threat condition, Republicans read the same text, but they read that it was blamed on Republicans. So again, a threat to the political in-group. We had two control conditions just to give us something to compare this to, and we kind of debated about what was more appropriate, so we decided to just include two different ones. In one of these, we had kind of a control condition focused on safety or security, where they read very similar text, but we just changed a couple keywords here in italics. So they read, many people in the US feel satisfied with the nation's condition. The US has reached a high point in terms of social, economic, and political factors. So this is more of a positive manipulation. Or they had a neutral condition where they just described how many people enjoy watching TV. So they engaged in a similar task, they read something and they wrote about it, but it was neutral, not meant to make people feel either threatened or safe, just be kind of a neutral thing to think about. With these control conditions, they weren't different in the data. So for analysis, we just combine people that were in each of these, and I'm not going to talk anymore about differences between those. So we'll just use the combination of those as our comparison group. We measured political threat as in studies 1 and 2, and in this study, this served as more of a manipulation check. So we're trying to manipulate political threat, and we basically want to make sure that that manipulation worked. So we follow that up by asking people if they feel threatened, and then we can make sure that people in our threat experimental conditions actually express more threat than people in our control conditions. And I'll show you that data. And then we measure conspiracy endorsement as we did in studies 1 and 2. So we used a list of very similar items, although we did update the ones that were didn't make sense anymore, given the outcome of the election and given that Trump was the current president. Okay, so our manipulation check showed that political threat was higher in the threat condition compared to the control conditions. So this just shows us that our threat manipulation was successful in making people feel relatively higher levels of threat. The threat condition produced increased threat for both Democrats and Republicans. So it worked, so to speak, for both Democrats and Republicans. It made both groups feel slightly more threatened. But we did also see in this data a main effect of party identification on threat, such that overall in this sample, Democrats expressed higher political threat compared to Republicans. We think this makes sense if you think again about the political context. So the data was collected in summer of 2019. Republicans had control of the presidency. They also had a Senate majority. Democrats had won control of the House after the 2018 midterm, but were still kind of disadvantaged in terms of the political dynamics at the federal level, at least. So overall, Democrats expressed higher levels of threat than Republicans, but our manipulation was still effective at increasing threat for both groups. So even though Democrats kind of started off higher, we still increased threat for them beyond where they were kind of at baseline at this time. So we then look to see if we ignore conspiracy type to start with, do we find effects of threat and political identity? And as we found in studies 1 and 2, and yes, overall we do. So there is a main effect of threat such that higher levels of threat produce higher levels of conspiracy endorsement, kind of regardless of which type of conspiracy you're asking about. In this study, we also found a main effect of party ID. In studies 1 and 2, we found that overall conservatives were more likely to endorse conspiracies than liberals. In study 3, we found the opposite. So here, our Democrat participants were more likely to endorse conspiracies than our Republican participants. Again, we don't know why for sure, but could be a function of political context. If they're feeling higher levels of political threat kind of just out in the world, then maybe that's part of what's explaining this difference. So again, I'll come back to this at the end, but we don't necessarily think that conspiratorial thinking is only a conservative or only a Republican phenomenon. We think it does occur for both Republicans and Democrats, again, as a function of context. The conspiracies, as in the earlier studies, worked as intended. So liberal or Democrats, in this case, more likely to endorse conspiracies targeting Republicans and vice versa. And then on the next slide, I'll show you our main analysis of interest, where we look at endorsement of the different conspiracy types as a function of threat and party identification. So here, I'll try to orient you to these figures. Again, on the y-axis is endorsement of conspiracies. So higher numbers indicate higher levels of conspiracy endorsement. On the left are conspiracies targeting Republicans. So these are conspiracies that Democrats should be more likely to endorse. And then on the right is endorsement of conspiracies targeting Democrats. So these are conspiracies that Republicans should be more likely to endorse. The data here is split into within each of these boxes. On the left are Democrats, on the right are Republicans. These are our Democrat and Republican participants, and then the same on the right. And then down here at the bottom, it's split by condition. So our control condition or our threat condition, and then we're just displaying this separately for Democrat and Republican participants. So if we start over here on the left, conspiracies targeting Republicans, overall, if you kind of combine these two bars, Democrats are much more likely to endorse these than Republicans, which makes sense. That's consistent with everything else we've seen so far. But we also get, in this case, a main effective threat such that for Democrats, feeling threatened compared to the control condition, increased endorsement. So this is a significant difference here. Such that if people felt threatened, they're more likely to endorse these conspiracies. In this case, we also get kind of a weird, potentially counterintuitive finding with Republicans, where threat also increased endorsement of these for Republicans. So overall, they're much less likely to endorse. But if Republicans were in the threat condition, they were slightly more likely to endorse conspiracies targeting their own group. Again, we haven't, or we didn't at the time try to differentiate this. You know, there's a bit of a division in the Republican Party, and there was at the time, and this sort of persists between people who support Trump and people who don't, even among Republicans. So it's possible that this is somehow driven by never Trumpers or Republicans that don't support Trump. But again, we haven't really disentangled that. Okay, so on the right are conspiracies targeting Democrats, and we find a somewhat similar pattern here. So overall, there's a main effective party. Republicans are more likely to endorse these than Democrats. And then we also find an effective threat, although it looks a little bit different here compared to what we saw in this graph on the left. Here for Republicans, if they were in the threat compared to the control condition, this increased endorsement of conspiracies targeting their outgroup, Democrats. But we don't see this for Democrats. So threatened Democrats are not more likely to endorse conspiracies about their in-group. This overall pattern makes more sense to us. But overall, we do find the threat effect when we look at, when we look at the kind of main conditions or segments of this that we're interested in. So it does increase endorsement of conspiracies targeting the political outgroup for both Republicans and Democrats. Okay, so I will try to wrap up in the next couple minutes, and then I'm happy to open it up for questions. Threat predicts political conspiracy endorsement, as does political ideology, as we showed in the data for study 1 and 2. Conspiracy endorsement, we argue, is not just a conservative phenomenon, as some have argued previously. We think this is a function of kind of the conspiracies that you select. And if you give people a broad array of conspiracies to pick from, some that they're more politically amenable to, then they will, in some cases, tell you that they endorse those. Sometimes threat and ideology interact. So threat in some cases is associated with greater endorsement of conspiracies for ideologues or people who are more highly identified with a political group. And sometimes they appear to work independently. So threat does increase endorsement, but we suggest this is more likely to happen in times where political threat is sort of heightened as a function of real world political context, like election outcomes as one example. In particular, in the study 1 and 2 data, we found that after the 2016 election, threat no longer seemed to predict political conspiracy endorsement for conservatives. But that data also showed that by April, a few months after inauguration, threat again started to predict endorsement of conspiracies for conservatives. And again, given that this is real world data, it's a little hard for us to isolate what exactly is causing this, but it's important to keep in mind too that Donald Trump was a very unusual president in that he voiced support for various conspiracy theories while he was the president. So it's kind of unclear, difficult to disentangle like how much of this is a Trump effect. If Trump supports conspiracy theories, then Republicans or conservatives may be doing it too, versus some kind of individual difference where conservatives are just more likely to do this in general, right? We can't really separate the Trump effect, so to speak, in this, given the time at which this data was collected. And then in study 3, we find that directly manipulating political threat to the in-group causes increased endorsement of political conspiracies targeting the political outgroup. So again, support for this kind of overarching idea that both identity and threat contribute and interact in terms of explaining the level of conspiracy endorsement that you'll see at any given point in time. I'm going to talk just very briefly about some implications and future directions, and then I'll leave this open. If anybody wants to come back to any of these in the discussion, we can certainly do that. So the data that we collected was mostly prior to the 2020 election. We didn't collect any additional data surrounding 2020, but of course, this continues to be relevant, right? If you lose the election, maybe you're more likely to support conspiracies about voter fraud. And I think we saw that in kind of an extreme way surrounding 2020, which again, ties into the next item here, which is support for political violence. We don't always see this get so extreme in American politics, and the events of January 6th were a very extreme example in terms of American political history that were directly tied to support for conspiracy endorsement in the aftermath of losing an election. I think, along with the idea that this is tied to political violence, which is something that we want to do more work on in the future. We've done a little bit of work looking at kind of individual difference factors that predict people's support for political violence. We did this a few years ago, so kind of prior to the events of earlier this year. We're interested in looking at how conspiratorial thinking contributes to this, so we may do some additional work to try to look at that. I've also been a little interested in populism since a workshop that I attended a couple years ago, which is actually where I met Andrew, that was focused on populism. So looking at kind of how how populism ties into this in terms of people who are attracted to kind of alternative ways of governing or are anti-elite. That kind of anti-elite sentiment has been shown to be related to conspiratorial thinking. They're not completely overlapping, but it may be the case that people who endorse conspiracies are probably more likely to support populism, whether it's left or right-wing populism. And then it may also be the case that people attracted to kind of populist ideas, given the anti-elitism there, might be more susceptible to conspiratorial thinking too, which is something we're interested in trying to look at. Along with that, another outcome kind of tied to support for political violence is decreasing support for democratic norms, which is something we're interested in looking at in future work. So as you start to endorse these ideas that your political outgroup is kind of conspiring against you, then you can't really support political tolerance anymore, right? If the outgroup is actually engaging in these horrible actions in secret to try to hurt your group, then it becomes really difficult to say that we should engage in tolerance and we should engage in compromise once you start to demonize the political outgroup in this way. And I'm not placing any judgment on it here to say whether this is like the right or wrong thing for us to do, but this is kind of what's happening to people psychologically. It has negative consequences for democracy. And then the question becomes like, when and why should people compromise their principles versus kind of digging in their heels? And there may be different ways of answering that depending on whether your focus is on preserving democratic norms or if your focus is on kind of reaching desired end goals, right? So there's a conflict there for sure. And then the last item here, we've been thinking a little bit more, and we haven't, we just haven't done any work on this yet, but it's obviously very relevant. We're interested in potentially doing some work looking at COVID-19 conspiracies and vaccine hesitancy in particular, and then of course looking at the way in which that's tied to politics. So COVID-19, the vaccine, et cetera, have been highly politicized. And these notions of kind of threat and identity and conspiratorial thinking are also very relevant for those issues too. Okay, so I will leave it there. I just want to mention my collaborator here, Stephen Schneider. He conducted a lot of this research and wrote the paper with me. This paper is not published yet, but we do have a preprint available on SciArchive if you're interested in looking at that. And then just acknowledge that we were funded by the University of Nebraska, and a couple different research groups gave us helpful feedback on this work.
Thank you very much, Ingrid. Find our well, next to the applause indicating, and we should, but before we do that, we should stop the recording.